Welcome to the deep dive. Hi, I'm Pat.
Hi, I'm Jesse.
And today we're really opening up quite a mix of sources. We're doing a deep dive into brief cognitive behavioral therapy, that's BCBT, and maybe more importantly, how his ideas connect with things we all experience. Things like, coping with feeling isolated, finding resilience, adapting when things get tough.
Yeah, it's a fascinating collection. We've got a detailed guide from VA.gov, which is quite clinical but also personal blog posts, a research paper that offers a really interesting way to think about coping, and some other articles looking at loneliness and how people adapt.
Right. So our mission really is to sort through all this material. We want to pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising bits, and give you a clearer understanding of, well, how our thoughts, feelings, and actions are all tied together.
And also how people actually deal with big challenges like isolation, and how therapy approaches, like BCBT, can be shaped to fit real lives, real situations.
Okay, sounds good. Let's jump in. Where do we start? Maybe with the basics of CBT itself.
Good idea. So cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, at its core, it's a framework. It's a way of understanding how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are linked. Often you feel like a situation directly causes an emotion, right?
Yeah, like that meeting made me anxious.
Exactly. But CBT suggests it's often the thoughts you have about the meeting, like, I'm going to mess up or they'll think I'm unprepared, that really drive the feeling of anxiety and maybe the behavior, like avoiding speaking up.
Which then probably makes you feel more anxious later thinking about it.
Right. It becomes a cycle. And the sources point out that with things like depression or anxiety, people often get stuck in these cycles, fueled by what they call unhelpful thinking patterns, those sort of automatic negative thoughts.
Okay, so that's the general idea. What makes the brief version BCBT different? Why brief?
It's basically CBT tailored for specific problems, and often, yeah, it's time limited, it's focused. You're not necessarily exploring every corner of someone's life for years. It's more targeted.
Gotcha. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. What kind of issues is it typically good for, according to the sources like that VA guide?
Well, the guide suggests it's pretty effective for things like um, adjustment disorders, struggling after a big life change, and also for anxiety and depressive disorders. It can also focus on specific symptoms, like tackling that negative thinking we just talked about.
Or helping someone build specific skills?
Exactly.
Hmm.
Like problem-solving skills or learning relaxation techniques, practical tools.
And figuring out if someone's a good fit for this brief approach. I remember the guide mentioned some important things to consider. It's not just about the diagnosis.
Oh, definitely not. Assessing suitability is key. You look at, for instance, the person's motivation. How much do they want things to change? Often, feeling distressed can actually increase motivation.
Makes sense. If you're hurting, you want relief.
Right. And their willingness to commit time is huge, especially for the work between sessions, the homework. That's really central to CBT.
Homework. Okay, we'll come back to that. What else matters?
Things like their current life stressors. If someone's in the middle of a major crisis, constant chaos, brief therapy might be tough. Social support matters too. And then, cognitive functioning, educational background, can they engage with the concepts, do the exercise?
And the severity, like how serious the problem is.
Yeah, that's a big one. The guide is clear that while BCBT is great for many issues, really severe conditions like, say, active substance dependence or severe mental illness, they usually need something more intensive, maybe a different kind of intervention altogether. It's about matching the tool to the job.
Okay, so let's say BCBT seems like a good match. What are the core elements? What makes it work?
Well, one of the absolute foundations, especially right at the start, isn't even a specific technique. It's the relationship between the therapist and the patient. The sources really hammer this home. Building trust, creating a safe space.
That holding environment idea you mentioned from the guide.
Exactly that. It's about empathy, really trying to understand, and validation reflecting back the person's experience without judgment, saying, it sounds like that was incredibly difficult, and meaning it. That feeling of being truly heard is what allows the work to start.
And it's not just passively listening, but actively picking up on themes.
Yes, listening for the patterns, the underlying messages, and summarizing them back. And then moving from building that connection to setting goals that needs to be collaborative, following the patient's lead on what feels most important to tackle first.
Okay, collaboration. And how does the therapist actually map out the problem, understand it in CBT terms?
That's called case conceptualization. It's the therapist's roadmap. A really common tool here is the ABC framework. A is antecedents, what happens before a behavior. It could be a situation, a thought, a feeling. B is the behavior itself. And C is the consequences, what happens after, both short-term and long-term.
Okay, let's try an example. Antecedent, feeling lonely, behavior, staying home, watching TV alone. Consequence, short term, maybe less effort, less anxiety about socializing. Long term, more loneliness.
Perfect example. It lays out the pattern. And as part of this, you're also exploring the person's cognitions, their thoughts. How do they see themselves, other people, the future?
But in brief therapy, you don't always dig super deep into core beliefs, right?
Right. The sources suggest the focus is often more on those immediate automatic thoughts and maybe the intermediate beliefs just below the surface. Tackling the deepest core beliefs usually takes more time than brief therapy allows. You focus on what's accessible and causing the most trouble now.
Makes sense. Be practical. And goal setting. You said it needs to be collaborative, but also specific. Not just, I want to feel happier.
Exactly. Goals need to be concrete, measurable, operational. So instead of feel less depressed, a goal might be, like the guide suggests, learn 2 specific cognitive strategies and 2 behavioral strategies to manage stress. Or maybe plan and do 1 enjoyable activity each week.
So it's about actions, skills.
Yes, that's a key point in the source's CBT emphasizes skill acquisition. You're not just talking, you're learning and practicing how to manage things differently. And checking in on readiness is important too. How important is this goal to you? How confident do you feel you can work towards it?
Which leads us right back to practice. That homework, the between-session work. Why is it so essential?
Because therapy isn't magic that happens only in the room. The section is where you might learn a new skill or perspective, but life happens outside the session. That's where you practice, where you apply it, where the changes actually take root. Explaining the why behind homework is crucial. It's not just extra work, it's the pathway to change.
Right, but what if someone just doesn't do it? Or can't? Is the therapy just stuck then?
Not at all. Actually, the guide frames homework non-completion as really valuable information. It's an opportunity to explore barriers. You don't criticize, you get curious. Was motivation low? Did they feel overwhelmed? Did they run into difficulties trying it? Or maybe did unhelpful thoughts about the homework itself get in the way? Like, this is stupid, or I'll fail anyway?
So it becomes part of the therapy itself, figuring out what got in the way.
Precisely. Sometimes starting the homework together in the session helps build confidence. And definitely, always reviewing it at the start of the next session shows it matters and helps troubleshoot any problems that came up.
Okay, this framework makes a lot of sense. The relationship, understanding the problem, setting goals, practice. Now let's get into some of the real nitty-gritty techniques. How do you actually work with those unhelpful thoughts?
Right, this is central. We mentioned automatic thoughts, those instant reactions. The sources talk about thinking in layers sometimes. You have the automatic thought right on the surface. Below that might be intermediate beliefs like rules or assumptions. If I make a mistake, it's terrible. And deeper still are core beliefs. I'm incompetent. In BCBT, the main focus is often catching and challenging those automatic thoughts.
Catching them. How? They can be so fast.
It takes practice. One of the main tools is the thought record. You can think of it like being a detective for your own mind. It's a structured worksheet, basically, to slow things down and examine a thought more objectively.
Okay, detective work. Walk me through the steps. What's on this record?
Sure. First, the situation. Just the objective facts, who, what, when, where. Then the automatic thoughts. What exactly went through your mind? You might even rate how much you believed it at that moment.
Okay.
Next, emotion and mood. What did you feel? Sad, anxious, angry? How intense was it, say, 0 to 100? Then comes the really analytical part. Evidence that supports the automatic thought. What facts back it up? And then just as importantly, evidence that does not support the thought. What facts contradict it or offer a different perspective? You actively search for this.
So you're forced to look at both sides, not just dwell on the negative.
Exactly. Based on all the evidence, you try to come up with a more balanced, realistic alternative thought. And the final step is to rate mood now. See if going through this process actually shifted how you feel, even a little.
That sounds really powerful. It creates distance, makes you question assumptions. The guide mentioned common distortions too, right? Like thinking the worst will happen, catastrophizing, or assuming you know what others think mind reading.
Yes, those are classic examples of the kinds of thoughts you might examine with a thought record. It definitely takes practice, and the sources emphasize reinforcing effort, not demanding perfection, especially at first.
Okay, so that tackles the cognitive side. What about the behavioral piece of CBT?
That brings us to behavioral activation. This zeroes in on the B in the ABC model behavior. The idea, especially relevant for depression, is that there's often this vicious cycle When you feel down, you tend to withdraw, you stop doing things.
Yeah, you lose interest, have no energy.
Precisely. But then that lack of activity, especially lack of rewarding or meaningful activity, actually feeds the low mood.
Mm.
It makes you feel worse, which makes you want to do even less. Behavioral activation aims to deliberately break that cycle.
How? By just forcing yourself to do stuff.
Sort of, but it's more strategic. The goal is to gradually increase engagement in activities that are meaningful or potentially rewarding, even if you don't feel like it initially. Sometimes you start by clarifying values, what's actually important to this person in life. Connection, achievement, learning.
And then planning activities related to those values.
Yes. Setting specific, concrete action plans like, this week I will go for a 15-minute walk on Tuesday and Thursday, or I will call one friend on Saturday. The key is explaining the rationale. The action itself can shift the mood. You act first, and the feeling follows, or at least might improve. It's acting opposite to how the depression is pulling you.
Acting your way into feeling differently, maybe.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so challenging thoughts, activating behavior. What other skills do the sources mention as being helpful in this BCBT toolkit?
Relaxation techniques come up quite a bit. They're useful for managing stress, anxiety, even physical symptoms that come with tension. The guide mentions setting aside a quiet, safe space to practice them.
Like progressive muscle relaxation. I think I've heard of that.
Yes, that's one. You systematically tense and then release different muscle groups, hands, arms, shoulders, face, etc., to learn the difference between tension and relaxation. Deep breathing is another big one. Really simple, but powerful. Focusing on slow, smooth breaths, maybe in through the nose, out through pursed lips. The great thing is it's portable. You can do it anywhere, anytime you feel stressed.
Yeah, that's practical.
And guided imagery is another, using your imagination to create a peaceful, calming scene in your mind, a beach, a forest, whatever works for you, often combined with deep breathing to enhance the relaxation effect.
Simple tools, but probably very effective for calming the nervous system. What about tackling like actual life problems, not just feelings or thoughts?
Good question. That's where problem-solving skills training comes in. The sources mention structured approaches, like one called SLVD. It helps you break down a problem systematically.
SLVED, what does that stand for?
Let's see. S is for selecting a specific problem. O is for listing options or brainstorm solutions. L is looking at the pros and cons of those solutions. I think V is for verify the best option. E is execute the plan, and D is decide if it worked, something like that. The core idea is a structured approach.
So instead of just feeling overwhelmed by a problem, you break it down into steps.
Exactly. The sources suggest helpful prompts too, like asking yourself, what advice would I give a friend? Or how have I handled similar things before? Or even talking it through with someone else. Just writing down the options and pros cons can make it feel more manageable and less emotional, and might even reveal some unhelpful thoughts about the problem itself that need challenging.
Okay, we've covered a lot about BCBT, the structure, the techniques. Now, I really want to connect this back to those, real human experiences you mentioned at the start, the isolation, the coping. How does this therapy framework relate to stories like Claudia's or Susan's?
Right, this is where it gets really grounded. Those personal stories vividly illustrate the pain of isolation. You hear Claudia talking about lockdown making her existing isolation worse, plus that fear of stigma. And Susan describes cancer treatment as this inherently lonely place, even when she had support around her, especially during those waiting periods.
Yeah, it shows that loneliness isn't just about being physically alone. You can feel isolated even when surrounded by people.
Absolutely. And Libby's story shows another angle, struggling with loneliness, but finding connection through supporting others. Then there's David's story about his father actively choosing to let relationships go, leading to profound isolation and impacting his mental state. It's a stark reminder of the consequences.
And the expat stories piece mentioned physical health impacts too. It's not just mental.
Oh, definitely. It highlights research showing loneliness can literally activate pain areas in the brain. It ramps up the fight-or-flight system, potentially weakens immunity over time, messes with sleep. It can create this downward spiral where feeling lonely makes you withdraw, which makes you lonelier. And it even compared deep homesickness to a form of grief.
Wow. So faced with this kind of pain, how do people cope? The stories offered some examples.
They did. We see people finding active, constructive ways. Claudia used writing, her blog, to process feelings and connect, finding her voice. Susan found that sharing her story helped her realize she wasn't alone in her feelings, which was therapeutic in itself. Luby kept busy and consciously maintained connections.
But coping isn't always like that, right? The Reddit thread mentions self-isolation as a coping mechanism.
Yes, that's a crucial point. Sometimes, especially if you've grown up in difficult or unsafe environments, isolating yourself might feel like the only way to stay safe or manage overwhelming feelings. It becomes a learned survival strategy.
Which sounds a bit like emotional detachment, creating distance.
Exactly. The Better Up source talks about emotional detachment as a defense mechanism. A way to shield yourself when feeling vulnerable is too dangerous or painful.
But that source also warned about unhealthy detachment.
Right. While it might offer temporary protection, chronic detachment can lead to problems. Difficulty with intimacy, lack of empathy, feeling empty or numb, relying purely on intellect and shutting down emotions, withdrawing from relationships and life.
This is where that research paper you mentioned comes in, the one with the different perspective. The PMC source.
Yes, this is such an important reframe. It introduces the idea that some behaviors we label as maladaptive, like chronic detachment or self-isolation, might be better understood as functional adaptations.
Functional adaptations, meaning they actually worked in some way.
Precisely. The idea is that these behaviors might have developed as a way to survive or cope within a specific, often difficult environment, maybe chronic stress you couldn't control, or adverse childhood experiences.
Ooh.
In that context, the behavior, while maybe not ideal long-term, helped the person get through. It was functional then.
So instead of judging the behavior as just bad, it's about understanding its origins, the purpose it served.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from blame or pathology to understanding the function of the behavior in its original context. And the implication for helping people is significant. It suggests interventions shouldn't just try to stamp out the behavior, but should focus on teaching a broader range of coping skills.
And helping people figure out when to use which skill, now that their situation might be different.
Yes. Building flexibility and having more tools in the toolbox appropriate for their current life and environment.
Okay, this brings it all back together. How does BCBT, with its techniques, fit into this picture of isolation, complex coping, and adaptation?
The connections are pretty direct, actually. Think about the therapeutic relationship itself. That safe, validating connection is a powerful antidote to isolation right from the start.
Okay, yeah. And the thought challenging.
Well, think about the thoughts that fuel isolation or detachment. I'm a burden, no one understands, it's safer alone, nothing will ever change. Using a thought record to examine the evidence for and against these beliefs can directly challenge the cognitive roots of withdrawal.
And behavioral activation seems like a natural fit, too.
Absolutely. It's designed to directly combat withdrawal and isolation by helping people gradually re-engage with activities and social connections that align with their values, breaking that cycle of inactivity and low mood.
And problem solving for practical barriers. Relaxation for the distress.
Yes. Problem solving can tackle concrete obstacles keeping someone isolated, like how to meet new people or manage social anxiety in specific situations. And relaxation techniques offer ways to manage the anxiety or physical tension that often accompany loneliness. The VA guide even specifically mentions loneliness and isolation as potential targets for BCBT. It's about providing tools to adapt in healthier ways now.
And importantly, BCBT isn't applied the same way to everyone. The VA manual stressed adapting it.
Crucial point. Therapy needs to be tailored. For instance, working with military members or veterans requires understanding military culture, things like stoicism, potential stigma around mental health. You need to address specific stressors like deployment experiences, be vigilant about suicide risk, and often leverage things like peer support.
And that Frontiers source added the point about resilience being teachable.
Yes, that resilience isn't fixed. It can be built, practiced, strengthened, like a muscle. A very hopeful message.
What about other groups, like people with medical illnesses?
For medically ill patients, you need to acknowledge the high rates of depression and anxiety that often go along with physical health problems. The focus might be more on health-related distress. You'd adapt behavioral activation to account for physical limits, adjust homework, maybe involve caregivers more.
Older adults.
With older adults, you'd assess for any sensory issues like hearing loss or cognitive changes that might affect therapy. Plans might need to be simpler, more concrete, and again, involving family or caregivers can be really helpful.
And if someone has more significant cognitive impairment?
Therapy needs to be adapted significantly then. Complex cognitive restructuring might be less suitable. You might lean more heavily on behavioral strategies, problem solving for concrete issues, and rely a lot on caregiver support to implement plans. It's about finding what works for that individual.
Wow. We've really covered a lot of ground, from the nuts and bolts of brief CBT, the techniques like thought records and behavioral activation.
To connecting it all to those very real, often painful experiences of isolation, looking at how people cope in complex ways, and understanding some coping as adaptation.
And finally, seeing how these therapeutic approaches need to be flexible and tailored to different people and situations.
Yeah, hopefully understanding these links helps demystify some of the struggles people face and shows that there are concrete strategies, paths toward healing and connection.
So, maybe a final thought for you listening. Consider how viewing coping, even difficult coping styles, through that lens of adaptation might change how you see things in yourself or others. Or maybe just reflect on the power of connection, highlighted in those stories, as a counter to isolation. And that idea that resilience is something you can actively build.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive today.
We really appreciate you spending your time with us. We hope you'll come back for our future explorations.
And if you found this discussion valuable, please do consider liking, sharing, or leaving a comment. It really helps others find the show.
Goodbye for now.